The sun came up slow over the Rocky Mountains the way it always did in April, pulling itself above the stone ridgeline like something that had earned the right to rise. The light moved across Ridgeback Valley in long golden sheets, touching the tops of the pines. First, then the meadowgrass still bent and silver with morning dew, then finally settling on the fence line where Elias Hargrove stood, with a hammer in his hand and a mind full of things he did not know how to fix. He was 34 years old. He had the hands of a man who had never once asked the land for anything he was not willing to work for. His face carried the particular weathering of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, not softened by shade or comfort, but marked by seasons in the honest way that wood is marked by rain. He was tall enough that men in town tended not to test him, and quiet enough that they sometimes forgot he was there until it was too late to take back what they had said. The fence post in front of him was cracked clean through, at the base heaved up by the weight of the winter snowpack. He drove the new post into the frozen earth, working the mallet in steady, rhythmic strokes, each blow deliberate and measured. It was the kind of work his hands knew without instruction. His mind was somewhere else entirely. From where he stood on the northern slope, the whole of Hargrove Ranch spread below him in the early light. The main house of squared pine logs, its stone chimney already trailing a thin ribbon of smoke because Seth had been up before dawn again. The big red barn with its doors standing open to let out the night air. The corral where three of the best horses moved in slow, easy circles. And beyond all of that, stretching east and west along the valley floor, the grass that Thomas Hargrove had chosen above every other piece of ground in the Colorado Territory 18 years ago, when a man with three small boys and a broken wagon and very little else could still find a valley that felt like it was waiting to be claimed. Thomas had not been wrong about the land. He had been right about almost everything that mattered. The creek that ran along the eastern edge never went dry, not even in the drought years. The northern slope caught enough sun through the summer to keep the grass thick and the cattle fat. The soil in the lower meadow was dark and deep and gave back everything you put into it. What Thomas had not been right about, or perhaps had simply not had time to account for, was the man in town with the polished shoes and the wire-rimmed spectacles and the leather portfolio under his arm. Silas Crane of the Ridgeback Bank, who had smiled at Thomas Hargrove and shaken his hand and offered him $800 at 8% interest when the roof of the barn needed replacing and the money was simply not there. That had been 2 years before Thomas died. Now Elias stood on the slope with his hammer and looked at the land his father had built and tried to understand how a debt of $800 had grown into something the bank now claimed was $4,214 with a deadline attached to it, like a fuse on a stick of dynamite. He drove the last nail home. He did not look at the numbers in his head because he could not make them work no matter how many times he tried. Mathematics had never been his country. It was not the country his father had prepared him for. Thomas Hargrove had taught his boys the language of cattle and seasons and soil. He had taught them how to read a horse and how to read weather and how to read a man's character from 50 yards. He had not taught them how to read a contract because he had trusted the man who wrote it. That trust had cost them everything, or very nearly everything. There were still 4 months. Or rather, there had been 4 months until Silas Crane sent the revised notice last week that cut the window to 30 days. Elias picked up his tools and walked back down the slope toward the house, his boots finding the familiar path without him needing to look at it. Behind him, the mountains were fully lit now, brilliant and indifferent the way they always were. The kitchen was warm when he pushed through the door. Seth was at the stove with his sleeves rolled past his elbows, moving a pan of cornbread off the heat with the slightly too casual air of someone who had been doing exactly this for the past hour and wanted it to appear effortless. He was 27, the youngest of the three, and he had their mother's coloring and their father's laugh, which meant the house had more light in it when he was around. Nathan sat at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and the expression he wore when something was sitting on his chest that he had not yet decided to say out loud. Nathan was 30. He had the build of a man who loaded hay every day of his life, which he did, and the eyes of someone who paid close attention to what people did not say, which he also did. He and Elias communicated largely through a vocabulary of silences and angles that Seth had spent years trying to learn and never quite managed because Seth's natural mode was speech and forward motion, and the straightforward declaration of what he felt, which was perhaps why the three of them worked as well together as they did. Elias poured himself coffee and sat. For a while, no one spoke. This was also normal. The three of them had lived together long enough that silence was not absence. It was just another room in the house. Nathan was the one who finally put words to it because he was always the one who eventually put words to it. $4,200, he said. He did not look up from his cup. In 30 days. I know, Elias said. I talked to Luke Prescott last week. Nathan turned his cup slightly on the table, a small rotation that meant he had been holding this information for a few days and had been deciding when to release it. And the Kellner widow before that. Both of them have the same kind of trouble with the bank. Martha Kellner lost her land last year. Luke is still fighting. Seth stopped moving at the stove. Why didn't you say so before? I said it now. Elias looked at his brother. Same kind of trouble, meaning what? Meaning their numbers don't match what they remember borrowing either. Meaning Crane tells them one thing and the paper says something else, and they can't prove the difference because they don't know how to read the paper the way it needs to be read. The fire in the stove crackled quietly. Outside, one of the horses called out and then went silent. Elias had been thinking about the notice on the table in the other room, the one with the bank's letterhead and Crane's signature at the bottom for 7 days, without sleeping through a single night. He had turned the problem every direction he knew how to turn it, and it came out the same way every time. He did not know enough. He did not know enough about contracts or interest calculations or the specific language that lawyers use to make things mean what they wanted them to mean. His father had built something extraordinary out of this land. But Thomas Hargrove had kept his own books and trusted the bank to keep theirs. And now the bank's books said things that the Hargrove boys could not read well enough to challenge. He reached across the table and picked up the folded newspaper he had set there 2 days ago. He opened it to the classified notices and placed it in the center of the table between the three of them. Nathan read it first. His expression did not change, which meant he was thinking seriously about it. Seth read it second. He looked up at Elias. You want to find a mail-order bride who knows bookkeeping. I want to find someone who understands financial records well enough to tell us what we're looking at, Elias said. If that person needs a safe place to live, we have a place to offer. That seems like a fair arrangement. It doesn't sound very romantic, Seth said. Nathan looked at his younger brother with the particular patience of someone who has had this conversation in its various forms many times. We have 30 days before we lose the land Father spent his life building. Would you like romance or would you like the ranch? Seth thought about this for what was given the circumstances a generous amount of time. I'd like both if it's possible. It isn't. Then the ranch, Seth said without any further argument, because whatever else Seth Hargrove was, he was never confused about what actually mattered. Elias read the notice one more time and signed his name to the response he had drafted the night before. The letter went out on the morning stage to Denver, and from Denver it would make its way east, and in approximately 3 weeks it would arrive in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, where a young woman named Clara Bennett was sitting at a table with a candle burning low, and a ledger book pressed against her chest like something she was afraid to put down. She had been afraid to put it down for 3 months. The ledger was her father's. Henry Bennett had been the most respected financial examiner in Cincinnati for 20 years, a quiet and precise man who wore the same brown wool coat every day from October through March and kept his desk so ordered that his clients always assumed incorrectly that his work was simple. It was not simple. Henry Bennett had a gift for the kind of patient, methodical analysis that could find a discrepancy in 10,000 lines of figures the way a surgeon finds a splinter buried in muscle by knowing exactly what healthy tissue is supposed to look like and recognizing the thing that does not belong. He had passed this gift to his daughter along with everything else he thought was worth passing on. Clara had sat beside him at his desk from the time she was 14, learning his system of notation, his shorthand codes, his method of cross-referencing counts across multiple ledgers to find the places where numbers told different stories in different places. She had an almost perfect memory for figures, the kind that runs in certain families like a particular shade of eye color, and she had her father's steadiness, the quality of not being hurried into a conclusion before the evidence was complete. Henry Bennett died on the 12th of January, 1876. The Cincinnati fire marshal ruled it an accident, a lamp left burning too close to a stack of papers on his office desk, the flames catching the dry winter wood of the old building, the whole structure gone by the time anyone noticed the smoke at 3 in the morning. Clara had not been asleep. She had been half awake in the small hours when her father paused outside her door on his way out, which was not something he ordinarily did when he went to his office for late work. He pushed the door open softly. He crossed to where she lay, and he placed the black ledger book gently in her hands, and in the dark he said three things to her, in a voice so quiet she almost thought she had dreamed it. He said, "Remember what I taught you. Do not trust any man's numbers without checking them yourself, and do not let this out of your sight." Then he was gone and she was alone with the book, and an hour later, the glow on the eastern sky was not the sunrise. 3 months later, she had read the book so many times she could recite most of it from memory. It was written in her father's private notation system, the same one he had taught her, a combination of geometric symbols and abbreviated codes that would mean nothing to anyone who had not been trained to read it. The later pages, the ones that clearly represented active investigations he had been conducting in the months before his death, described a pattern he had been tracking across multiple small banking operations in the Western Territories. False originals replacing signed contracts, interest calculated against inflated principal amounts, administrative fees appearing without contractual basis, and the money, when he had traced it as far as he could trace it from Cincinnati, was flowing toward a land development company in Denver with no visible purpose other than to accumulate title to property along a specific corridor in the Colorado mountains. The last legible entry in his private notation system identified the source of his most recent information as a contact in a place called Ridgeback Valley. The notation he used for this contact indicated someone he had judged to be credible, cooperative, and in possession of documentary evidence. The entry was dated October 12, 1874. Clara had looked at that date for 3 months. She knew what it meant. Her father had been careful and slow in his work, unwilling to act on anything until he had enough to stand on. He had been building towards something in those last weeks. Someone in Ridgeback Valley had reached out to him, had shared their suspicions, had given him material he could cross-reference against his own research. And then that someone had apparently stopped communicating because there were no further entries about Ridgeback Valley until the final pages, where her father had written in plain text rather than code, as though he had stopped worrying about who might read it. Going to Denver in February. Will present full findings to territorial authorities. Everything I have is in the black book. The fire in his office happened in January. Clara read the notice from the Hargrove Ranch in Colorado twice, the second time more slowly than the first, paying attention to the line that most people placing advertisements like this did not include preference given to applicants with experience in financial management or business administration. She wrote her response that evening and paid for it to go by the fastest available post. She did not tell anyone in Cincinnati where she was going. There was no one left to tell. The train from Denver to the small depot at Milford Junction took most of a day and crossed country that Clara had no reference for, country that operated on a completely different scale than anything Ohio had prepared her for. The plains gave way to foothills, and the foothills gave way to the mountains, and by the time the train was moving through the high passes with snowfields on either side of the track, and nothing but blue sky above, Clara was sitting with her forehead against the glass, and her hands around the black ledger in her lap, and something in her chest that she could not quite name, some complicated combination of grief and purpose, and a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with altitude. She stepped off the train at Milford Junction in the middle of a Colorado afternoon and found herself on a platform with 3 other passengers who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. She stood for a moment with her travel bag in her ledger and looked around, and then she saw the young man near the end of the platform who was leaning against a post with his hat pushed back at an angle that was either the result of inattention or deliberate ease, and who was looking at her with the open and uncomplicated expression of someone who had been looking forward to this particular afternoon. He was tall and broad and blond, with the kind of face that defaulted to a grin, the way some faces default to suspicion. "Miss Bennett," he pushed off the post and came toward her. "I'm Seth Hargrove, the youngest one." He reached for her bag before she had a chance to offer it, lifting it with the automatic ease of someone for whom lifting things was simply something hands were for. Elias wanted to come himself. He would have accepted one of the mayor's pick today to have a difficult time of it, and you can't walk away from that. And Nathan stayed to watch the ranch. He gestured toward the wagon waiting at the end of the platform with 2 sturdy horses already in harness. "So you got me." Is that a disadvantage? Clara asked. Seth thought about this with what appeared to be genuine consideration. Well, I'm friendlier than Nathan and more predictable than Elias, so depending on what you were hoping for, it might actually be an improvement. He smiled. Also, I know the best road to take that isn't all switchbacks. She climbed up to the wagon seat and Seth took the reins, and they left Milford Junction heading west toward the mountains, and for a while Clara did not speak because the land required her full attention. She had not expected it to be this way. She had read about the Rocky Mountain territories and looked at drawings in Eastern newspapers and thought she understood in some general sense what the word magnificent was meant to convey. She had not understood. The mountains were not scenic. They were not decorative. They were simply enormous in a way that made everything human feel appropriately small, and the sky above them was the kind of blue that has no parallel in any manufactured color, and the valley they were descending into as the road began to wind downward was green in the way that spring is green when it arrives after a long winter, and the grass has been waiting. Beautiful, isn't it? Seth said. He did not make it a question because he already knew. I don't have the right word for it, Clara said. My father used to say, Colorado doesn't need compliments. It makes its own case. A brief pause. He passed 2 years ago, riding accident on a road he'd traveled for 30 years. His voice kept its evenness, but something in his shoulders shifted by a fraction. He was the best horseman I ever saw. Clara held this information carefully. She did not respond to it immediately because she was not yet ready to say what she was thinking. The road continued west and downward. 20 minutes from the ranch, Seth mentioned the bank the way a person mentions something that has been sitting in the room the whole time and has finally gotten heavy enough to put on the table. Elias has been up most nights trying to work out the loan situation, he said. The bank says we owe $4,200. Father originally borrowed $800. The contract said 8% interest. He shrugged a gesture that was trying to be casual and not quite making it. I was never much for figures, but I don't see how 8% on $800 becomes $4,000 in 2 years. Clara looked at him. It doesn't, she said. Seth turned his head. Pardon, 8% compound interest on $800 over 2 years comes to approximately $931. Adding generous administrative costs, you might reach $1,100. You cannot reach $4,200 through any legitimate calculation from those numbers. The math is simply not possible. Seth stared at her for a moment longer than was compatible with watching where the horses were going. Then he looked back at the road. Then he looked at her again. You just did that in your head, he said. My father was a financial examiner. He taught me arithmetic the way your father apparently taught you horses. It's the same kind of knowing. Seth was quiet for a stretch. Then he said quietly and with more weight than his usual register, I think Elias is going to be glad he answered your letter. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last stand of pines, and Clara saw it before Seth pointed to it, saw it whole in one moment as the road curved and the valley opened up. It was not large by Eastern standards, but it had the quality that she associated in her mind with things built to last rather than built to impress. Every element of it was fitted to purpose. The main house of notched pine logs, solid and direct, with a stone chimney that spoke of winters taken seriously. The great red barn with its doors open to the afternoon air. The corral with its careful fencing. The creek flashing silver along the eastern boundary. Beyond the buildings, the valley meadow spread green and deep, and on the hillsides, small dark shapes moved slowly through the grass. Elias Hargrove came out of the barn as the wagon stopped. He had been working. That was plain from the state of his clothes and his hands. He moved the way men move when physical labor is not effort, but simply the medium through which they exist, and he was taller than Clara had anticipated and broader with sun-darkened skin and amber-colored eyes that did not look away from things they were looking at. He looked at her 3 seconds, maybe 4. She had the impression that he was assessing not what she looked like, but how she held herself, what she was carrying, and how where her eyes went first. Miss Bennett, he said. His voice was lower than Seth's and carried less music but considerably more weight. Mr. Hargrove, she said. She did not look away. She did not smile in the apologetic way that women sometimes smile when they feel the need to soften their own presence in an unfamiliar place. She simply met his eyes and stood where she was. Something passed across his face too quickly to name. Seth will show you where to put your things, he said. Whoppers at 6, make yourself at home. He gave a short nod that included both of them in its conclusion and walked back toward the barn. See, Seth said beside him, friendly. Nathan appeared from the direction of the equipment shed just as Clara was following Seth toward the house. He stopped when he saw her. He was built similar to Elias, but his face was more angular, and his eyes were sharp in a different way, the way of someone who forms opinions quickly and then waits to see if they need revision. You're from Cincinnati, he said. It was not a greeting, it was an opening position. I am, Clara said. You've done farm work? No. Then what makes you useful out here? Again, not a question in any conventional sense, but a problem statement, the kind that expects an answer worth the breath it takes to give one. I can read a financial contract and tell you whether the numbers in it are honest. I can find a discrepancy in a bank ledger the way your brother apparently finds weak fence posts. I can do things with figures that most people in most rooms cannot do. She paused. Is that sufficient, or would you like me to keep going? Nathan looked at her for a beat. She would come to understand a man who dealt with information the way a well-made engine deals with fuel efficiently without waste, with a clear output at the end of the process. It might be enough, he said. He walked past her toward the house. Seth watched him go. That's actually very warm for Nathan. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a large room with a plank table and a good iron stove, and windows facing south that caught the afternoon light. Clara offered to cook, and Seth accepted before she had finished the sentence. She worked with what was in the larder. Thickened venison stew skillet, cornbread, strong coffee, the kind of meal that a working ranch expected and a working ranch deserved, and when the four of them sat down around the table at 6, the food was ready and the coffee was hot. Nathan ate in silence, but ate a second portion without being asked. Seth talked in the comfortable way he always talked about the mare, who had finally delivered twins that afternoon, about a fence section on the north pasture that still needed repair, about a neighbor named Prescott, whose well had gone dry last summer and who had been hauling water all winter. Elias ate and listened, and occasionally asked a short, precise question that redirected the conversation exactly where he wanted it, which Clara noticed and filed away. When the plates were cleared and the coffee pot was making its rounds again, Elias set his cup down and looked at the far end of the table where Clara had been quietly keeping track of the stack of papers he had evidently left there before supper and forgotten to put away, or perhaps had left deliberately. Those are the bank documents, he said, the contract, the statement of account, the payment notices. I saw them when I came in, Clara said. They've been looked at by 3 different people in this valley who are smarter than they let on, and none of us can make the numbers come out the way the bank says they do. Clara set her own cup down. $800 principal at 8% annual compound interest over 24 months equals $931.20. The bank is claiming $4,214. The difference is $3,282.80. She said this the way she might say that the sky outside was blue. That gap cannot exist through honest calculation. Something has been altered. Either the principal figure in the original contract is not what your father actually signed for, or there are fees in the statement that have no contractual basis, or both. The kitchen was quiet. Seth had stopped moving. Nathan had put his cup down. Elias looked at her steadily. How do we prove it? I need to see the original contract, not a copy, the document your father signed. The bank holds the originals. That is likely by design. She folded her hands on the table. But your father must have kept some record of his own transactions. Business correspondence, personal notes, anything written in his own hand that references the amount he borrowed and the terms he agreed to. A man who built what your father built does not do it by not paying attention. Elias and Nathan looked at each other, and in that look was a conversation Clara could not hear, but understood the shape of. Then Elias pushed back from the table and went into the smaller room off the main hall that served as his office, and he returned with a wooden box of papers and set it on the table. Go through it, he said. Take what you need. She worked until midnight. The 3 brothers went about the business of the evening, checking the horses, banking the fire. The last ordinary tasks of an ordinary ranch day, but they moved through the kitchen periodically, in the way that people move through a room where something important is happening, unable to entirely stay away from it. What Clara found in the first 2 hours confirmed what she had suspected. The statement of account included a line item labeled administrative and processing fee in the amount of $450 appearing in the fourth month of the loan, with no explanation and no corresponding entry in the original loan terms. The principal amount stated in the bank's copy of the contract was $1,200. But in a letter from Thomas Hargrove to a hay supplier dated the same month as the loan he referenced, the $800 I borrowed from Ridgeback, without any ambiguity the way a man references a fact he is certain of. $800 versus $1,200. $400 of principal that had not existed when Thomas Hargrove put his signature on the page. Clara sat back in her chair and looked at the lamp flame for a moment. Then she looked at what she had written in her own notes and looked at it again to make sure she had not made an error. She had not made an error. She never made errors with numbers. She was reaching for her coffee cup when her eyes fell on the one document she had set aside without fully reading, because it had seemed at first glance to be a personal letter rather than a financial record. She picked it up again now. It was a page torn from a small notebook, written in a handwriting she did not recognize, and at the top in ink slightly darker than the rest, as though it had been added later, and with more deliberate care were the letters HB and a date. October 12th, 1874. The room went very still around her. The lamp seemed to burn without flickering. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the pines. She read the rest of the page. It was a set of notes abbreviated and partially coded in a system she did not immediately recognize. But the date was unmistakable. And the initials, H.B. Henry Bennett, October 12th, 1874. She had memorized every page of her father's black ledger book. She had read the final entries so many times she could have written them from memory in the dark. She knew the date of the last notation about his Ridgeback Valley contact. She knew the coding system her father had said could only be read by someone he had personally trained. October 12th, 1874. The last notation, source confirmed cooperative, documentary evidence in hand, meeting planned for mid-month. Thomas Hargrove died on October 15th, 1874. She had learned this from Seth riding in the wagon through the mountain afternoon, riding accident on a road he had traveled for 30 years. She was still sitting with the paper in her hands when she heard Elias come back into the kitchen from the final check of the night. He stopped when he saw her face. She looked up at him. She made herself look at him directly and steadily, the way she always tried to look at things that were hard, because looking away from hard things never made them easier to account for. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat. She placed the page from Thomas Hargrove's notebook on the table between them, and beside it she placed her own small notebook open to the page where she had transcribed the most important lines from her father's black ledger, the lines that referred to his contact in Ridgeback Valley. "Those initials," she said, pointing to the letters at the top of Thomas's page. "HB, your father wrote those. And then the date October 12th, 1874. Elias looked at the paper, then he looked at her notebook. Then he looked at the paper again. "My father's full name was Henry Bennett," she said quietly. "He was a financial examiner in Cincinnati. He spent 2 years building a case against a pattern of bank fraud he had identified across several Western territories. The last active investigation in his files was a banking operation in Ridgeback Valley, Colorado. The final notation in his personal records about his contact here is dated October 12th, 1874, 3 days before your father died. The fire in the stove made a small sound. The lamp burned steady. Elias did not move for a long moment. He was the kind of man who processed information the way deep water processes. A stone dropped into it completely, without rushing the ripples moving outward in every direction from the point of impact. "They were working together," he said finally. Not a question, a statement of something he was putting into place. "Your father found something he couldn't prove alone. He reached out to someone who had the skills to help him build the case. My father was that person." Clara's voice was steady because she had been living with this knowledge for 3 months and had already done most of the falling apart that needed to be done. "My father died in a fire in January of this year. His office at 3 in the morning ruled an accident. I don't believe it was an accident." Elias looked at her. The amber eyes were very direct. "Your father never told you he was in contact with someone here?" "No, and mine never told me either, not in any way I understood at the time." She looked down at the 2 pages on the table between them, the handwriting of 2 men who had apparently been trying to do the same thing from opposite ends of the country. But your father kept notes, and my father taught me how to read notes that weren't meant to be read by strangers. She touched the corner of Thomas's page with one fingertip. What they were building together, what they both apparently understood, and neither of them survived to complete it's here, in pieces. And I think I can put it together. Elias was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that has substance to it. Then he said in a voice that was lower than usual and stripped of its ordinary careful reserve, "My father was the best horseman I ever knew. He rode that road for 30 years without a fall." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make it easier or less true. "What do you need?" Elias said at last. "Time, access to everything your father kept, and the chance to speak with at least one other family in the valley who has been through the same thing with Crane's Bank." She met his eyes. "There's a woman named Martha Kellner. You mentioned her land was lost last year." He nodded slowly. "She would talk to us. She knows me." "Then that's where we start." She folded her hands over her notebook. "Mr. Hargrove, I need you to understand something before we go any further. My father started this investigation because he believed it was the right thing to do. He did not survive it. I came here because your name was in his records and because I had nowhere else to go, and because finishing what he started is the only thing I can do for him now." She paused. "I am not afraid of what this might cost, but I need to know that you and your brothers will let me work without second-guessing every step." Elias Hargrove looked at her across the table in the lamplight of his father's kitchen on his father's land, with his father's papers spread between them. He looked at her the way he had looked at the valley that morning from the northern slope, with the particular attention of a man who knows the difference between what is real and what merely appears to be. "I'll tell Nathan and Seth in the morning," he said. "We'll sit down together and you can say what you found. All of it." He stood and pushed his chair back. "Get some rest, Miss Bennett. The morning comes early out here." He took the lamp from the windowsill and left her one that was still nearly full, and then he walked down the hall toward his own room, and Clara sat alone in the kitchen of the Hargrove house with 2 dead men's handwriting in front of her, and the wind coming down off the Rockies and moving through the pines outside with a sound that was neither welcoming nor threatening, but simply present the way the mountains were present, enormous and indifferent, and there regardless of what happened to the small human beings below them. She closed both notebooks and held them against her chest for a moment, the way she had held her father's black ledger on the train platform in Cincinnati, when she had still not known exactly what she was going toward. Then she set them down on the table side by side, 2 thin volumes that together contained the partial truth of something that had already cost 2 lives, and she picked up the lamp and went to the room Seth had shown her, and she lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the Colorado night until it carried her under. In the morning, the sun came up over the mountains again, the way it always did, pulling itself above the ridgeline with the slow patience of something that has earned the right to rise. And the 4 people in the house below it gathered around the kitchen table with coffee and with the evidence spread between them, and began to understand together the shape and the scale of what they were facing. Neither of them fully understood yet how far it reached, but they were about to find out. The morning after Clara laid out everything she had found, Nathan Hargrove saddled his horse before sunrise and rode into Ridgeback alone. He did not tell anyone exactly what he intended to do there. He said he had errands, which was true in the way that a dam holding back a river has something to do with water. He rode the 12 miles to town at an easy pace that was designed to look like a man with no particular urgency on his mind, and he arrived at Ridgeback just as the Mercantile was opening its shutters and Jake Morrison was sweeping the front step of his saloon with the deliberate strokes of a man who has been doing the same thing at the same hour for 15 years. Nathan had been drinking in Jake Morrison's saloon for 10 of those 15 years, which was long enough that his presence in the morning was not remarkable, and long enough that Jake would talk to him the way Jake talked to someone he had no reason to be careful around. That was what Nathan was counting on. He tied his horse to the rail and went inside and ordered coffee, because it was too early even for Jake's standards to order anything else without raising questions. Nathan did not want to raise. He sat at the bar and let the room fill up around him, which it did gradually, as the morning progressed. Ranchers and mine workers, and the particular floating population of the frontier who had business of one kind or another in the only town for 30 miles in any direction. Nathan listened more than he spoke. He was very good at listening. It was one of the things people tended to underestimate about him because his face was not expressive and his responses were short, and so they assumed he was not paying close attention. He was always paying close attention. He had simply learned early that a man who speaks little hears more. Over the course of 2 hours, working his way through 2 cups of coffee and a brief exchange about winter cattle prices with a rancher named Dillard from the south end of the valley, Nathan gathered the following. The Prescott family had missed their last 2 loan payments to Ridgeback Bank. The Holt family had sold their eastern pasture in November under circumstances that their oldest son, speaking to Dillard at the feed store, apparently had characterized as not strictly their choice. And a man named Cole Whitfield, who had run 40 head of cattle on the creek land north of town for 6 years, had packed his family up and left the valley in February without telling anyone where they were going. 3 families, 3 different outcomes. The same bank behind all of it. Then Nathan asked Jake, in the idle way of someone filling the silence between drinks, whether he knew what happened to property when people couldn't pay Crane back. It was the kind of question that could be answered superficially and moved past, which was what Nathan was hoping for, and which was exactly what happened, because Jake started talking about the land registry in the way that people talk when they know something interesting and are looking for an excuse to share it. Jake's cousin, a man named Kurt Dawes, who worked in the Territorial Land Registry office on the east end of Main Street, had mentioned to Jake over Christmas dinner that there had been an unusual number of title transfers going through Ridgeback in the past 2 years, more than the office had processed in the previous 5 years combined. What was strange, Kurt had said, was not just the volume, but the destination. Almost every one of those transfers ended up registered to the same company out of Denver, a company called Pacific Continental Land and Development Corp. Nathan finished his coffee. He set the cup down. He looked at the row of bottles behind the bar for a moment, the way you look at something that is not what you are actually seeing. Big operation, that company, he said. Jake shrugged. Kurt says they don't seem to do much with the land once they get it. Just hold it. Which struck him as odd because holding land costs money and taxes, and there's no income from it unless you're running cattle or mining or something. Unless you're waiting for something, Nathan said. Unless that, yeah. Jake moved down the bar to refill someone else's cup. Nathan put 2 coins on the bar and walked out into the Ridgeback morning, and he stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing in particular, fitting pieces together in his head with the quiet, systematic patience that was his most underestimated quality. A company that held land without using it was a company waiting for the land to become more valuable, or a company waiting for a specific purpose that had not yet arrived. In the Colorado Territory in 1876, there was one development that made otherwise unremarkable agricultural land in a mountain valley enormously valuable almost overnight. It had happened in other valleys already. Nathan had heard the discussions in this very saloon, the arguments about whether the railroad coming through was a blessing or a catastrophe, depending on who owned what when it arrived. A railroad needed a corridor. It needed flat ground along water because the engines ran on steam, and steam required water every 30 miles. It needed land already cleared of the heaviest timber, and it needed more than anything to acquire that land at a price that would not eat the profit from the enterprise before the first rail was laid. Nathan untied his horse and rode home. He arrived back at the ranch in the early afternoon to find Clara at Thomas's old desk with papers spread around her in the organized chaos of serious analytical work, and Seth mending a bridle on the porch, and Elias somewhere in the upper pasture. That was his habit when he needed to think without walls around him. Nathan sat down across from Clara and told her what he had learned. He was not a man who dramatized things, so he told it plainly, and in order the way you'd report the inventory of a supply room. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she turned to a blank page in her notebook and wrote a single word at the top. Railroad. Nathan looked at the word. That's what I was thinking. Crane isn't keeping the land, she said. He's a collection mechanism. Someone in Denver is paying him to do the acquiring, and Pacific Continental is the vehicle they're using to hold the title until the railroad pays for it. The profit from the price difference between what Crane extracts from the families and what the railroad will eventually pay for prime corridor land would be enormous. Enough to be worth killing for, Nathan said. He said it plainly without drama, which was somehow worse. Clara set her pen down. Yes, she said, enough for that. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them in the small room that smelled of old pine and saddle leather, and the particular dust of a working ranch with the afternoon light coming through the south window and making long rectangles on the floor. "We need more than what we have," Clara said finally. "We need the original contract your father signed, the one Crane is holding. And we need at least one other family willing to put what happened to them in front of someone with the authority to act on it." "Martha Kellner," Nathan said, because he had been thinking about this too. "That's what Elias said last night. He's right. She's stubborn enough and honest enough, and she has nothing left to lose." He stood. "Tell Elias when he comes in. The two of you should go to Kellner Ranch. I'll stay here with Seth." He walked to the door and paused. "You're good at this," he said without looking back. "So was my father," Clara said. Nathan nodded once and went out. The sound Seth heard that same afternoon came from behind the north wall of the horse barn, in the narrow alley between the back of the barn and the boundary fence where no one had any particular reason to be, and where the acoustics of the timber walls carried sound in unexpected ways. Seth had been inside repairing a break in the saddle stitching that had been bothering him for a week, and he was on his knees in the corner stall with his back to the outside wall when he heard the voices. They were not loud. They were the voices of men who believed they were not being overheard, which meant they were speaking at the volume of a conversation meant to stay private, and that volume was, as it happened, just sufficient to carry through the gap between two boards that the winter had worked loose. The first voice Seth identified as belonging to Wade Decker. Decker was the deputy sheriff of Ridgeback Valley, a broad-mustached man in his mid-40s who wore his badge with the particular visibility of someone who had worked hard to get it and intended to make sure it was seen. Seth had never trusted him for reasons he had never fully articulated, even to himself, the way sometimes a dog knows a thing before a man does. The second voice Seth did not recognize. It was flatter and quieter than Decker's, the voice of someone accustomed to not being the most important person in a room. "He says same as before," the unfamiliar voice said. "The girl from Cincinnati is a problem. He knows whose daughter she is." A pause, wind in the pines, a horse moving in the stall nearest Seth. He held completely still. "What does he want done about it?" Decker said. "He doesn't want her here long enough to dig. She's already been asking questions in the house. She had papers out last night that she shouldn't have." "How does he know what she had out?" The other man didn't answer that directly. "He said to move the timeline up, 30 days instead of 4 months. Get the pressure high enough that they can't think about anything else. And the girl herself. He said if she's smart, she'll leave when things get uncomfortable. If she's not smart, that becomes a different conversation." The unfamiliar voice dropped lower, not quite below Seth's range of hearing. "The last time things got complicated, it took months to clean up. He doesn't want that again." Decker said something Seth could not catch. "Then, all right, I'll deliver the notice tomorrow." Footsteps moving away, the creak of the gate at the end of the alley. Then silence except for the horses in the wind. Seth stayed on his knees in the corner stall for what might have been 2 minutes. He was not a man who stayed still for 2 minutes under ordinary circumstances. But these were not ordinary circumstances, and he understood that with a completeness that settled into him like cold water settling. The last time things got complicated. He put the saddle down and walked to the house. He told them everything that night around the kitchen table, 4 of them, after Elias had come in from the upper pasture. Seth was capable when necessary of setting aside his natural inclination toward ease and speaking with the kind of precision that important information deserves. And this was one of those times. He got through the entire account without editorializing, which cost him something, but which the situation required. When he finished, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Elias said very quietly, "The last time things got complicated." That's what he said. "Father's riding accident." Seth met his eyes. "I don't know that for certain, and I'm telling you what I heard." "But that's what it means," Elias said. Nathan had his hands flat on the table, a posture Clara had come to recognize as his version of holding himself very still. "Crane knows who you are," he said to Clara. "He knows whose daughter you are. That means he knows about Henry Bennett, and he knows why you're here." "Or he suspects," Clara said. "He may not know exactly how much I know, which is why he wants me uncomfortable enough to leave rather than simply acting directly." She paused. Though that may change if we give him enough time. Then we don't give him time, Elias said. He looked around the table. We go to Kellner Ranch, tomorrow early. Nathan, you and Seth stay here. If Decker comes, you've heard nothing, and you know nothing, and you're working the cattle the way you always work the cattle. He looked at Clara. You and I go to Martha Kellner. We see what she has, and then we decide what to do with it. The morning brought Decker before they could leave. He arrived at 7 with a man Clara had not seen before, and a folded document in his hand, and he crossed the yard with the particular walk of someone carrying official weight they are aware of and intend to use. Elias stepped out onto the porch alone, which was also deliberate. Clara watched from inside the kitchen, one hand on the windowsill. Decker handed Elias the document and said his piece about the bank's right to accelerate the repayment schedule under terms of the original contract, citing a clause about the bank's discretion regarding collateral risk, which was the kind of language that could mean anything a clever lawyer wanted it to mean. Elias read the document without any change in his expression. Clara could see the line of his jaw from the window, the small movement of muscle there that was the only visible sign of what was happening inside. 30 days, Elias said. That's correct. The original agreement said 4 months. The bank has reassessed its position. Decker looked past Elias toward the house, a sweep of his eyes that was professionally casual and professionally deliberate at the same time. I understand you've had a visitor recently, a lady from back east. He made it sound friendly. It was not friendly. Crane wants the Hargrove family to know there's no hard feeling here. This is business, not personal. He'd be happy to sit down and discuss the situation. We'll be in touch, Elias said. He took the document inside and closed the door. He set it on the table in front of Clara. She read it in under a minute. When she looked up, all 3 brothers were watching her. He's accelerating because something changed, she said, and he felt it. Whatever Decker told him about what's happening here, it was enough to make him decide that waiting 4 months creates more risk than it resolves. She folded the document and put it with the other bank papers, which means we have less time and he's more dangerous than he was yesterday. Then we leave for Kellner Ranch now, Elias said. They rode through country that unfolded differently in the morning than it did in the afternoon, the light coming from the wrong angle for familiar things and making them look briefly strange. Elias led on his bay horse at a pace that covered ground without punishing it, and Clara kept up on the smaller chestnut mare named Penny that Seth had assessed her against with more subtlety than he usually displayed, watching how she held herself before recommending that particular horse. They did not talk much for the first hour. The silence between them was different from the silence of the first day. It had become without any formal negotiation. A working silence of the kind that 2 people fall into when they are thinking about the same problem from different angles and do not need to fill the space between the angles with noise. It was Elias who spoke first. The road we're on runs east to west along the valley floor. He said, not by way of small talk, but in the tone of someone who has decided a particular piece of information is relevant. There's no other flat route through this section of the mountains, Brians. North you climb 3,000 feet in 4 miles. South the canyon walls run sheer to the river. He watched the terrain around them as he spoke the automatic vigilance of a man who had grown up reading this land. Any railroad line coming from Denver heading west for the mining country would have to follow this exact corridor. There is no alternative. Clara looked at the creek running beside them, the line of cottonwoods along its bank, the meadow grass that was thickest here in the flat bottom of the valley. And the land along this corridor, she said. Hargrove, Kellner, Prescott, the Whitfield place that's empty now, 3 others. He named them without looking away from the road. All of them with outstanding loans from Ridgeback Bank. Clara took out her small notebook and wrote without slowing her horse. How long has Crane been operating the bank? Since '68, 8 years. And the loans that are now in dispute all originated between '72 and '75. After the Transcontinental was completed and the major lines started looking for their next projects. She closed the notebook. He set up the operation deliberately. Moved into a valley with exactly the geographic profile the railroad would need, established relationships and trust over years, and then began systematically creating the conditions to acquire the land cheaply. Using our own borrowed money as the mechanism, Elias said. The fraud is almost elegant. Your father borrows $800. The bank alters the original contract to show 1,200. Adds fees with no contractual basis. Calculates interest against the inflated principal. 3 years later, the debt is mathematically unreachable, and the family sells the land at whatever Crane offers because they have no other choice. She let the horse find its own footing over a rocky stretch before continuing. Your father saw the pattern before it closed around him. That's why he reached out to my father. Elias was quiet for a while after that. When he spoke again, it was to something adjacent to what they'd been discussing, but not exactly the same. My father was not a man who asked for help easily, he said. He did everything himself for 18 years. Built every structure on that ranch by hand. Raised 3 boys alone after my mother died. Never borrowed anything from a neighbor that he couldn't pay back the same season. He shifted in his saddle slightly, the small adjustment of a man carrying something he has been carrying for a long time. For him to reach out to a stranger in Cincinnati and admit he had something he couldn't handle alone, that would have been the hardest part. Clara thought about her own father, about the careful, methodical man who kept his desk ordered and his coat the same, and who had spent 20 years building a reputation on the simple practice of telling the truth about numbers, regardless of who preferred a different truth. My father kept a notation in his records for sources he considered trustworthy, she said. He was not free with that notation. He used it perhaps a dozen times in 20 years. She looked at the mountains ahead of them. He used it for your father. They reached Kellner Ranch in the early afternoon. Martha Kellner was 61 and had been on her own for the better part of a year, and she had the quality that certain solitudes produce in people who were already determined, a concentrated, distilled version of herself without the softening that company and routine provide. She met them at the door with a rifle held at her side, not raised but not put away, and her eyes moved between Elias and Clara with the quick assessment of someone who had learned to take in a situation completely before deciding how to respond to it. Hargrove, she said, not unfriendly, just accurate. Mrs. Kellner. Elias touched his hat. This is Miss Clara Bennett. She's been staying with us. She's a financial examiner, and she's been looking at the bank records. Martha's eyes settled on Clara with new attention. Come in then, she said. She leaned the rifle against the doorframe and stood back to let them through. The kitchen of the Kellner house was smaller than the Hargrove kitchen, but ordered with the same fundamental seriousness, the seriousness of people who live by what they grow and keep and cannot afford waste. Martha set coffee on the table and sat across from them and waited because she was not a woman who prompted. Clara laid out what she had found in the same way she had laid it out for the Hargrove brothers, but faster now because she had done it once already and the essential shape of it had not changed. Martha listened without expression. She was, Clara thought, one of those rare people who could receive difficult information without the defensive scaffolding that most people erect around themselves to manage the weight of it. When Clara finished, Martha stood up without speaking and went to the room at the back of the house. She returned with a metal tin, the kind used for flour or dried goods, repurposed now as a document box, and she set it on the table and took off the lid. Inside were papers organized with the care of someone who had known at some level that these papers might matter eventually. Wallace kept records of everything, Martha said. He had a saying, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. He drove me half to madness with it when he was alive. She paused. I'm grateful for it now. Wallace Kellner's notes were meticulous. He had recorded the date and amount of every payment he made to Ridgeback Bank. He had written down the original loan terms as he understood them at signing. He had noted in his small, tight handwriting the date when he first noticed the discrepancy between what he believed he owed and what the bank claimed he owed, and the 2 conversations he had tried to have with Crane about it, and the outcomes of those conversations which were nothing. Clara cross-referenced Wallace's notes against the bank's statement. Same pattern. The stated principal in the bank's copy of the contract was higher than what Wallace had written as the agreed amount. There was an administrative fee with no contractual basis. The calculated interest exceeded what 8% compounding over the loan period could produce by a factor that could not be explained. His signature, Clara said. She looked up at Martha. Do you have anything else he signed around the same time as the loan, a letter, a bill of sale, anything? Martha thought for a moment and then went to the small writing desk in the corner and came back with a letter Wallace had written to a cattle buyer in Denver dated 2 months after the loan. Clara placed the letter beside the loan contract. She looked at the signatures. Wallace Kellner had apparently taught himself to read and write as an adult, which produced a particular kind of handwriting carefully formed, slightly labored with idiosyncratic letter forms that a person teaches themselves rather than being taught. His capital W was formed as two adjacent V shapes, a habit Clara had seen only in self-taught writers. It was as distinctive as a fingerprint. The signature on the loan contract showed a W formed as a single rounded letter school, taught unremarkable belonging to any of 1,000 literate men of his era. It did not belong to Wallace Kellner. Martha looked at the two signatures placed side by side and said nothing for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was even in the way of someone who has already grieved the thing and has now passed the acute stage into the harder sustained one. "He didn't sign that paper," she said. "No," Clara said, "he didn't." Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere in the tall grass beyond the fence, the bright liquid sound of it entirely indifferent to what was happening inside the house. And for a moment, all three of them simply sat with the weight of what the two signatures meant side by side on the kitchen table. Martha reached out and touched the edge of the loan contract with one finger, not picking it up, just touching it, and then she pulled her hand back. "Wallace had a heart attack 7 months after we lost the land," she said. "The doctor said his heart was weak. Maybe it was, but I know what took the strength out of him." She looked at Clara with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who has decided something. "Whatever you need from me, wherever you need me to stand and say what I know, I will do it." "We're going to need you to be willing to make a formal statement," Clara said, "when we have the right person to make it to." "I'll be ready," Martha said. "I've been ready." They rode back in the long afternoon light, the mountains turning gold and then amber, and then a deep rose color as the sun dropped behind the western peaks. Clara was quiet with what they had found at the Kellner Ranch, fitting it into the larger structure of everything else, seeing where it belonged and what it proved and what it pointed toward. She was aware of Elias riding beside her in the same concentrated way that she was aware of the mountains and the quality of the light as something that was simply present and real and did not require comment to be acknowledged. "It's a complete picture now," she said eventually. "Two contracts with altered figures, two forged signatures, a pattern of fraudulent fees across multiple families, a company in Denver collecting title to land along the only viable railroad corridor in the valley." She watched the road ahead. "It's enough to act on, if we can get it to someone with the authority to act." "Who does that?" "Why, the territorial governor's office in Denver, or faster, a newspaper." She looked at him. "A story in the Denver Post about systematic land fraud and potentially two suspicious deaths connected to it would force the governor's office to respond regardless of whatever relationship Crane may have cultivated there." Elias considered this the way he considered most things without rushing it. "You know someone at the Denver Post?" "No, but my father did, and I have his correspondence files." She paused. "The man he worked with there, a reporter named Fletcher Reed, was the person he trusted most when it came to investigations that needed to become public. My father wrote about him in terms I recognized as his highest form of professional respect, which was not a quality he gave out casually. You'd write to Reed. I'd send him everything we have and let him verify it independently. His verification plus our documentation, plus Martha Kellner's testimony would be very difficult to suppress, even for someone with Crane's local influence." She was quiet for a moment. "We'd need to send it from Millersburg, not Ridgeback. Decker controls the post riders out of Ridgeback, and we can't know what he inspects. Millersburg is a day's ride." "I know. We'd go together." "I assumed so," she said. Elias looked at her briefly in the fading light. Something in his face settled the way a decision settles when the person making it has finally found solid ground under it. 3 days, he said. "We prepare what you need to send. Then we go." What followed was 3 days of work, the kind that happens in the hours between the ordinary work of the ranch and sleep. Clara at the desk that had been Thomas Hargrove's writing by lamplight, until her hand ached organizing the evidence into a form that would make its own argument to a reader who knew none of the context. She wrote in the precise, clean prose of someone trained to present information without embellishment, because the information itself was sufficient, and she drew on her father's notation records, and the Hargrove Ranch documents, and the Kellner papers, and her own analysis of the loan structures to build something that had the cumulative weight of documented truth. Elias brought her coffee at midnight on the second night without her asking for it, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the papers spread across the desk, and then went back to his own room without saying anything. But in the morning there was fresh coffee already made when she came downstairs, and the morning's barn work was done before first light, so that he was ready to leave when she was. They were saddling the horses when it happened. Clara had left her riding bag in the room she was using and went back for it, and when she pushed open the door, she found the bag open on the floor and the notebook she had been using for her daily working notes was gone. Her own notebook, the one with the detailed financial analysis, was gone. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the open bag and the empty space where the notebook should have been. Then she went through the rest of the room. The bag, the small trunk, under the mattress where she had never put anything. She knew before she was finished that it was only the one notebook, the one she had been writing in every day, the one that contained the clearest and most organized version of her analysis of the bank records. She sat down on the edge of the bed. 3 days of work. Every key figure and connection laid out in plain language, designed to be read by someone who had never seen the original documents. Elias was in the doorway. He had seen her face when she came back out to the yard and had followed her without her noticing. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He stood very still in the doorway, and the quality of his stillness was different from his usual considered quiet. It was the stillness of someone managing a very large and very cold feeling. "When," he said, "last night or before dawn. I had it when I went to bed. It was gone when I came back for the bag just now." She looked at him. "They know what I've been building, and they know it was almost finished." He stepped into the room and looked at the open bag, the empty spot, the general evidence of a search conducted quickly by someone who knew what they were looking for and where to find it. He looked at these things with the focus of a man cataloging damage before deciding on repair. "Can you reconstruct it?" he asked. "All of it. My memory for figures is exact." She met his eyes. "But it was 3 days of written work. Writing it again will take time we may not have." "Then we don't write it again the same way." He came farther into the room and sat in the chair by the desk, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. And for a moment, Clara could see in the angle of his shoulders the weight of everything that was pressing on this ranch and this family, the 2 years of carrying it alone before she arrived, the accumulated cost of watching his father's land come under threat from a direction he had no map for. "You kept the black book," he said. It was not a question. He knew she had it. He had seen her with it. "It's not here." She reached under the loose boards she had worked free at the edge of the floorboards near the wall, the first thing she had done when Seth showed her the room 3 weeks ago before she had even unpacked. She pulled out the black ledger. "My father kept copies, not of everything, but of the things he considered most critical. He always said the document anyone might want to take is the document you must never keep in only one place." Elias looked at the black book. He looked at her. The amber eyes were direct and unguarded in the way they occasionally became when he stopped managing how much he was showing. "They came into this house," he said. "Yes." "Into your room?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood. "We leave for Millersburg this morning, right now. We take the black book and we take everything else you can carry in your memory, and we send it from Millersburg where Decker has no hands to stop it." He paused at the door. "And we don't come back through Ridgeback." "Elias," he turned. She held the black book against her chest, the familiar weight of it, the weight she had been carrying for 3 months through grief and uncertainty, and the long train ride west and every day since. "They had something to gain by taking the notebook," she said. "They wouldn't have risked coming into the house if they weren't afraid. People who have already won do not take risks. They take risks when they are afraid of losing." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed. Not softened exactly, because Elias Hargrove's face did not have a mode that could be called soft, but opened slightly the way a heavily constructed door opens when someone finally finds the key that fits. "Get your coat," he said. "The morning is cold." The road to Millersburg went north before it went west, climbing out of the valley along a timber track that the mining operations had cut years ago, and that was now the most reliable route for anyone who wanted to reach the next town without going through Ridgeback. It was rougher going than the main road, and it took an hour longer, but neither of them suggested taking the shorter way. They climbed through the pine forest with the cold morning air pressing close, and the horses working at the grade, their breath coming in small, visible clouds. The sky above the trees was the deep cloudless blue of high-altitude spring mornings, the kind of blue that has a quality almost like sound to it, a clarity that seems to carry further than ordinary sky. At a point where the track broke out of the trees onto a south-facing ridge, Elias stopped. Below them, the full length of the valley was visible, lying green and silver in the morning light, the creek winding through it, the scattered rectangles of ranch buildings at intervals along the flat ground. "That line," he said, tracing it with one hand, the gesture of someone who has spent a lifetime reading this specific landscape. The way the valley runs, the creek following the low center, the grade of the hillsides on both sides. A train engineer looking at a map would see it in 30 seconds. He dropped his hand. "All that land, Hargrove, Kellner, the Prescott place, the empty Whitfield property, 4 miles of the most accessible corridor in the Colorado mountains with water the whole length of it. And all of it currently and in the process of being extracted from the people who built it," Clara said. He looked at the valley for another moment, then he looked at her. "My father chose this land," he said. "He walked this ridge. He saw what you're seeing right now, and he saw something worth spending the rest of his life on. Not because of what it was worth to anyone else, because of what it was." Clara did not say anything. She was listening to something under the words, the thing the words were carrying, that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but some third thing that had no good single name. "Whatever happens in the next few weeks," he said, "and whatever Crane manages to do or not do, that is not a small thing. What my father understood about this place." He moved his horse forward again. "It shouldn't be taken by paper." They reached Millersburg before noon. Harold Webb's post office occupied the end of a short commercial block and smelled of paper and sealing wax and the faint chemical smell of the dyes used to print postal markings. Webb himself was a compact, careful man in his 60s who had the watchful neutrality of someone who has processed a great deal of other people's business without becoming interested in it, which was a useful quality in a postmaster. Clara wrote the letters at the counter, filling 2 separate envelopes with everything her memory and her father's black book could provide. The first letter was addressed to Fletcher Reed at the Denver Post, the name she had found in her father's correspondence files, written in her clearest hand, with the kind of systematic clarity she had learned at Henry Bennett's elbow over 8 years of apprenticeship. She laid out the financial structure of the fraud, the forged signatures, the Pacific Continental connection, the probable railroad corridor, the 2 deaths that had interrupted the original investigation. She attached transcribed figures from both the Hargrove and Kellner contracts with her analysis of the discrepancies, and she included the relevant passages from her father's black book copied out in plain language, with the original notation system translated. The second letter went to the governor's office in Denver, shorter and more formal, requesting an official inquiry and citing the specific families affected and the documentary evidence available for examination. She sealed both envelopes and paid the postal fee from the money she had carefully maintained since leaving Cincinnati, the last of what her father had kept in the household account, which she had withdrawn in full the week after his death against exactly this kind of eventual need. Harold Webb stamped both envelopes and wrote the registration numbers in his ledger, without reading what was on them, and placed them in the outgoing mail pouch for the next day's courier run to Denver. Clara watched the envelopes disappear into the pouch. She stood at the counter for a moment after Webb had moved away, her hands resting on the worn wood, aware of the particular quality of a moment when something that has been building for a long time has finally been released and is now traveling toward its outcome under its own momentum. Elias was waiting outside with the horses. He looked at her face when she came through the door. "Done," she said. He nodded once. He held Penny's reins out to her. They rode home by the long road, the afternoon following them down through the timber and back into the valley. The light was golden by the time the ranch buildings came into sight. Seth and Nathan's figures visible at the corral fence at a distance doing the end-of-day work in the comfortable automatic way of men who have done the same work at the same hour for years. Neither Clara nor Elias had said much on the return trip. The silence between them had taken on a new quality, not the working silence of the morning, but something that had more weight in it, the weight of shared knowledge and shared stake, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who have been afraid of the same thing at the same time and chosen separately and together to stay in front of it anyway. At the gate to the yard, Elias stopped his horse, and Clara stopped hers beside him, and they sat for a moment in the last light looking at the ranch that Thomas Hargrove had built from nothing, and that 3 generations of stubbornness and skill and honest labor had kept alive against all the ordinary losses that land and weather and bad luck could produce. "We wait now," Claire said. "We wait," he agreed. "Fletcher Reed will either act on what I sent him or he won't. Clement Hollis at the governor's office will either respond or he won't. We have very little control over what happens next." "That's true. And Crane knows the notebook is gone and knows we've been moving. He'll be watching." "Also true." She looked at him. The angle of the evening light caught the planes of his face and made them look like something carved, something that had taken a long time and a great deal of pressure to become what it was. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Elias Hargrove turned his head and looked at her with the amber eyes that did not look away from things they were looking at. "Not of Crane," he said. "Crane, I understand. A man who builds his life on taking what belongs to other people eventually finds people who won't let go of what's theirs." He looked back at the ranch. "What I'm afraid of is making the wrong move and losing what my father built because I moved wrong." "Then we move carefully," she said. "We move carefully," he agreed. They rode through the gate together, and Seth looked up from the corral fence and raised a hand, and Nathan stood straight and watched them come in with the expression of a man calculating what the return of 2 people from a long day tells him about how the day went, and the horses walked into the yard in the long gold light of the Colorado evening, and the mountains stood behind everything enormous and patient, waiting without opinion for whatever came next. There were 14 days between sending the letters and any possibility of a response, and those 14 days were their own kind of trial. The particular difficulty of having done everything within your reach and now being required to live inside the waiting without falling apart in it. The ranch provided its own answer to this, as it always had, because cattle and horses and fences and weather do not pause for human anxiety. Nathan rode the fence line on the north pasture and found 3 sections that needed work. Seth helped repair them, and in the evenings, when they came in tired enough, that thought was less of a problem. He taught Clara the names of the mountains visible from the north slope. A different mountain for each direction, you turned each one with a story attached to it that Seth carried, the way he carried most things lightly and with enjoyment. Nathan said very little about any of it. But on the 8th day of waiting, he rode to the Prescott farm to return a borrowed tool, which was a thing that could have waited another month without consequence. And when he came back in the evening, he sat down at the kitchen table and told them without preamble about the Prescott boy, 17 years old, who had been working at the Ridgeback livery stable since November to send money back to his family because the farm could not support them the way it had before the bank problem started. He told them this without editorializing, which was his way, but he told it, and Clara understood that Nathan Hargrove did not share information that was not meant to be heard and thought about. She thought about it. The Prescott boy, working at a livery stable at 17 because of what Crane had built. The Whitfield family, who had simply disappeared into the territory rather than fight it. Martha Kellner alone in her house with her tin box of documents and her dead husband's careful handwriting. The Hargrove brothers riding their father's fence lines and sleeping poorly, and never quite saying to each other the fullness of what they were feeling. On the 14th day, Seth was the one who saw the rider coming up the valley road. He came in from the porch and said with the restrained urgency of someone who has learned to carry news carefully, "There's a man riding in from the east, not anyone I know." The rider came in from the east at a pace that was neither urgent nor casual, but something in between the pace of a man who has a destination he intends to reach and has been riding long enough that he has made his peace with the distance still between him and it. He was in his late 30s, dressed in a coat that had been good quality once and was still serviceable, and he carried a leather satchel across his saddle that was clearly heavy with paper. Elias stepped out onto the porch. Clara came and stood at his shoulder. Nathan materialized from the direction of the barn the way Nathan tended to materialize when something required assessment, and Seth remained at the corner of the house, which was his version of a strategic position. The rider pulled up at the yard gate and looked at the 4 of them with the quick, evaluative glance of someone accustomed to walking into rooms where he does not know the temperature and reading it fast. "Looking for the Hargrove Ranch," he said. "I was told in Ridgeback that this was the road." "This is it," Elias said. "Then I'm in the right place." He stepped down from the horse and looped the reins over the gatepost with the practiced ease of a man who spends a significant portion of his life getting on and off horses between destinations. My name is Fletcher Reed. I'm a reporter for the Denver Post. I'm looking for a Miss Clara Bennett, who sent me a letter approximately 2 weeks ago that I have been thinking about since the morning I read it. Clara stepped forward from Elias's shoulder. I'm Clara Bennett. Fletcher Reed looked at her with the attentive, slightly arrested expression of someone who had formed an expectation from a letter and was now revising it against the reality. The letter had been precise and authoritative and built with the logic of someone who understood financial instruments at a level that most financial institutions would have found impressive. The woman standing in front of him was 22 years old and looked it, and there was a quality in the way she stood that reminded him of certain lawyers he had covered in Denver courtrooms, people who had learned early that the authority in a room does not always belong to the person who looks most like they expect it. Your father was Henry Bennett, he said. He was. I knew Henry. Not well, but I knew him. He glanced at the satchel on his saddle. I have things to show you that I believe you will want to see, and I have questions about things in your letter that I want to verify before I publish a word of any of it. He looked at Elias. If you'll have me for a few hours, I'd be grateful. Get your horse settled, Elias said. We'll put coffee on. They sat around the kitchen table, which had become over the past weeks the place where the important things happened in the Hargrove house, the natural gathering point of a family working through something too large for any single room or any single mind. Fletcher Reed opened his satchel and laid out what he had brought, and what he had brought was considerable. He had been doing his own work since the morning he received Clara's letter, working the way reporters work, when they know they have something real and are unwilling to act on anything they cannot independently verify. He had gone to the Territorial Land Registry in Denver and pulled the public records for every property transfer in Ridgeback Valley over the past 3 years. He had used the corporate registry to look up Pacific Continental Land and Development Corp. And found that its principals were not local Colorado businessmen, but were instead 3 partners in a law firm in Chicago with documented connections to 2 of the major railroad companies currently surveying western expansion routes. He had spoken off the record with a surveying engineer he knew who had worked for one of those companies, and the engineer had confirmed without naming the specific valley that a corridor matching the description of Ridgeback Valley had been in the preliminary planning documents for a western line since at least 1873. He spread these documents across the table, and Clara went through them with the focused attention of someone reading in a language they know extremely well, checking figures against what was in her memory of her father's black book, and against what she had analyzed from the Hargrove and Kellner records, fitting Reed's independent findings into the structure she had already built. The fit was exact. It's the same picture from a different angle, she said. Your documents establish the destination for the land. Mine establish the mechanism for acquiring it. She looked up at Reed. Together they show the complete chain. Crane is the local instrument. Pacific Continental is the holding vehicle. The railroad money is at the end of it, waiting for the land to be fully assembled before the price is negotiated. What I can't show independently, Reed said carefully, is the link between the fraudulent contracts and Crane personally. I have the land transfers. I have the company records. I have the surveying connection. What I don't have is a signed contract with someone else's name on it and a witness who can testify that the signature doesn't belong to the person who supposedly wrote it. I have both of those things, Clara said. 2 contracts, 2 families, 2 witnesses who knew the signatories and can identify that the signatures are false. Reed was quiet for a moment. He looked at his documents and then at Clara, and then at the 3 Hargrove brothers who were arranged around the room in their different ways, Elias standing near the window, Nathan sitting at the far end of the table, Seth leaning against the wall with his arms folded, but his attention fully present. There's something else in your letter, Reed said. He looked at Clara directly. You wrote that your father's death and the death of Thomas Hargrove may both be connected to this investigation. That's a very serious claim. I know it is. I can't publish that claim without evidence that goes beyond the circumstantial. I know that too. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to publish it yet. I'm telling you so that you understand what we're dealing with and why the speed of publication matters. The more time Crane has to understand what's coming, the more opportunity he has to make evidence disappear and to make it difficult for people to say what they know in a public setting. Reed nodded slowly. What are you proposing? Crane has called a public meeting at the Ridgeback Town Hall for 2 days from now, Elias said. He intends to use it to formally establish the Hargrove debt in front of the community, to use social pressure to complete what the legal documents have started. He wants witnesses to our capitulation. Instead, Clara said, we want witnesses to something else. The plan that emerged over the next hour was the kind of plan that works because each part of it is the natural responsibility of the person best suited to carry it. Clara would speak at the meeting and present the financial evidence in terms that any literate person in the room could follow the same clear systematic argument she had been building since the night she arrived at the Hargrove Ranch. Reed would attend as a reporter visibly with his notebook, which would communicate to Crane before a word was spoken that the story had already left Ridgeback Valley and could no longer be contained within it. Nathan would ride that evening to every family in the valley whose name appeared in Thomas Hargrove's notebook and invite them to the meeting not as a show of numbers, but because they were the people most directly affected and they had the right to hear the truth spoken in public. Seth would ride to Millersburg before dawn on the day of the meeting and meet Clement Hollis, the territorial inspector from the governor's office, who had sent a wire to the Millersburg post office 3 days earlier, indicating he was already en route in response to the letter Claire had sent. And Elias and Nathan would be outside the meeting hall because Fletcher Reed had made a point that Clara filed away without immediately responding to that men who are losing a great deal of money do not always respond to public exposure with graceful surrender, and that the particular men Crane employed were not known for their patience with legal process. Outside the hall, Elias said in the tone of someone confirming an assignment he had already accepted. You're more useful there than inside, Reed said. Inside, what's needed is her. He glanced at Clara. Outside, what's needed is something else. Elias looked at Nathan. Nathan said nothing. Neither of them needed to. That night, after Reed had been shown to the bunkhouse, and Nathan had ridden out to begin making his rounds of the valley families, and Seth had gone to bed early to be ready for his before dawn departure, Elias came out onto the porch and found Clara already there. She was sitting on the bench at the far end of the porch with her coat pulled around her, looking out at the valley in the dark. The mountains were invisible, except as a blacker density against the dark sky. Their presence felt more than seen enormous and patient as always. The stars were out in the full unclouded abundance that the high altitude and the distance from any city made possible, more stars than Clara had ever seen in Ohio, so many that they gave the darkness a kind of luminosity. Elias sat on the porch steps. For a while, neither of them spoke, which was a kind of speaking they had become fluent in with each other over the weeks of working through the same problem from their different angles. You should sleep, he said finally. Not an order, something closer to concern expressed in the only register he was comfortable with. I will, she said. I needed some air first. He looked out at the dark valley. Are you afraid? She thought about the question the way she thought about numbers, looking for the exact answer rather than the approximate one. Of Crane, I'm not afraid, not exactly. Of failing, she paused. Of going through all of this and still losing the ranch. Of it not being enough. It's enough, he said. You don't know that yet. I know what you've built. I've watched you build it. He turned his head and looked at her in the dark with the directness that was his most characteristic quality, the unwillingness to look at things indirectly that extended to people as much as it extended to fence lines and cattle and land. Your father started something because he believed it was worth starting. You came here and finished it. Whether or not every outcome goes the way we want it to go, what you've done is real. It doesn't stop being real because the next 2 days are uncertain. Clara looked at him for a moment. In the starlight, his face was composed and serious, the face of a man who says what he means because he has never learned the habit of saying otherwise. Do you believe we'll win tomorrow? She asked. He considered this with the care he gave to questions that deserved care. I believe Crane is afraid. I believe afraid men make mistakes. And I believe that what you're going to say in that room tomorrow is true. And I've lived long enough to know that the truth has a quality to it that most people can feel even if they can't explain it. My father used to say something similar. He was right. She looked back out at the valley, at the darkness where the mountains were, and the brightness where the stars were, and the thin silver line where the creek caught the light along the eastern boundary of the ranch. Elias, she said. He waited. I trust you, she said, not as a preliminary to anything else. Just the statement itself offered, because it was true, and because it seemed to her that true things, when they exist between people, should be said directly, rather than implied and waited for. He was quiet for a moment after she said it. I trust you too, he said. And then, after another pause with the slight roughness of someone unaccustomed to saying the words, but committed to saying them correctly, I've trusted you since the second morning, when you sat across from me with my father's flowers in front of you and told me the truth about what the number said. I didn't know then how to say that it mattered. He looked back at the valley. It mattered. Clara did not look away from the mountains. Go to bed, she said. The morning comes early out here. She heard him stand, heard his boots on the porch. Boards heard the door open and close. She sat alone for a little while longer, looking at the stars above the mountains that her father had never seen, and that Thomas Hargrove had looked at for 18 years, and that tomorrow would still be there regardless of what happened in the Ridgeback Town Hall, enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to the small human beings below them who were trying with their documents and their memories and their stubborn refusal to let go of what was theirs to make the truth count for something. Then she went inside. The morning of the meeting arrived clear and cold, the kind of April morning in the Colorado high country that reminds you winter is not finished even when it appears to be. Seth left before first light, moving quietly through the dark house and out to the barn where his horse was already ready because Seth had a gift for departures. Clara heard him go and lay awake for a few minutes and then got up and dressed and went down to start the coffee. Elias was already in the kitchen. They did not say much over the coffee. There was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said, and the work of saying it was done. What remained was the doing. They rode to Ridgeback, four together, Clara and Elias and Nathan and Fletcher Reed, taking the main road because there was no longer any reason to avoid it. The day was bright and the road was dry, and the mountains on either side of the valley were beginning to lose their snow at the lower elevations, the bare brown rock showing through in patches like something emerging after a long concealment. The Ridgeback Town Hall was filling when they arrived. Nathan had done his work the previous evening, and the results were visible in the faces Clara recognized from the documents she had spent weeks studying the Prescott family from the north end of the valley, the people who had been their neighbors for years and who had come because Nathan had told them simply that it was time to hear the truth spoken in a room with enough people to make it stick. Martha Kellner sat in the third row with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and the clear, steady eyes of a woman who has made a decision she intends to honor. Silas Crane was at the front of the room at a table that had been set up for the official presentation, and he had brought Wade Decker and two men Clara had not seen before who were positioned near the door in a way that was meant to look like they were simply standing, and that did not look like that at all. Crane wore his best suit, the charcoal gray one, and his wire-rimmed spectacles caught the morning light from the windows, and his practiced smile was in place, and when he saw Clara come through the door with Elias Hargrove and Fletcher Reed, he had approximately 3 seconds in which the practiced smile did not change before it did subtly becoming something smaller and more controlled. When he saw Reed's notebook, he became very still in a way that stillness is sometimes the opposite of calm. The town mayor, a man named Arthur Pell, who had been running a dry goods store in Ridgeback for 20 years, and who had never once in those 20 years wanted to be in the middle of a serious conflict, and had spent most of his tenure successfully avoiding it, opened the meeting with the procedural language of someone who intends to keep everything as orderly as possible and senses that this may be difficult. Crane presented the Hargrove case with the smooth, practiced fluency of a man who has made similar presentations many times. He was good at it. He deployed the figures and the timeline and the contractual language with the assurance of someone who knows that most people in a room will accept numbers presented confidently by a man in a good suit as being the numbers that exist because most people have not been trained to question them. When he paused, Clara stood up. She did not raise her hand first or ask Mayor Pell's permission in the tentative way of someone who expects to be refused. She stood in the way of someone who is exercising a right that exists and that she intends to exercise, and she said clearly and with a preamble that she had information relevant to the matter before the meeting and requested the opportunity to present it as was customary in public proceedings. Pell looked at Crane. Crane's expression was the expression of a man calculating whether refusing was a better position than allowing it, and concluding in approximately 2 seconds that refusing would in front of this many witnesses create a different and worse problem than allowing it. He gave the small shrug of a man conceding a point he intends to recover later. Pell said she could speak. Clara walked to the front of the room. She was aware of the particular quality of a room full of people who have not decided what to think about you. She had felt it before sitting with her father in examinations, where the outcome was uncertain and the audience was not friendly. Her father's advice about that feeling had been practical and specific. Do not try to manage the room, manage the information. The information, if it is accurate and presented clearly, manages the room by itself. She began with the numbers because the numbers were where everything started and where everything ended. Because numbers in the end do not care what anyone believes about them. She stated the original loan terms as Thomas Hargrove had recorded them in his own hand, $800 at 8% annual compound interest. She stated what those terms produced over 24 months of legitimate calculation, $931. She stated what the bank was claiming was owed $4,214. She stated clearly and without drama that no legitimate financial calculation produces the second number from the first. Then she talked about the contract. She described what she had found in the Hargrove papers and what she and Elias had found at the Kellner Ranch, the principal amount in the bank's copy of the contract that did not match what the borrower had recorded at the time of signing. She asked, addressing not Crane, but the room, whether anyone present who had borrowed money from Ridgeback Bank in the past 4 years still had their own notes from the time of signing, their own record of what they had agreed to. 4 hands went up. And then after a moment in which people looked at each other, 2 more. She asked each of them to state what they remembered borrowing. She asked each of them what the bank was now claiming they owed. She did not make the comparison herself. She let the room make it. The room made it. She could feel it happening, the collective recognition of people who have each been carrying the same inexplicable number in isolation and who are discovering for the first time that they are not alone in carrying it. Crane stood. This is not a relevant proceeding for claims against other accounts. This meeting was called specifically to address the Hargrove family's outstanding debt, and I must object to the expansion of the scope beyond. Clara turned to look at him. She was aware that looking at Crane directly and calmly was itself a kind of statement, because he was accustomed to being the person in the room whose gaze others met carefully. Mr. Crane, she said, this is a public community meeting. The claims I'm presenting are relevant to the community because they affect multiple members of this community. If you have a legal objection to information being presented accurately in a public forum, you're welcome to state the legal basis for that objection. He looked at Mayor Pell. Pell looked at the room. The room looked at Crane with the focused attention of people who have just been given a reason to pay attention to him that they did not previously have. Pell said he thought Miss Bennett could continue. She continued. She described the administrative fees. She described the pattern across multiple accounts. She placed on the table in front of Mayor Pell the copies she had made from the Hargrove documents and the Kellner documents with her analysis of the discrepancies written out in plain language so that anyone who could read could follow it. And then she placed on the table the document she had saved for last, the records Fletcher Reed had obtained from the Denver Territorial Registry showing the chain of land transfers from Ridgeback Valley families to Pacific Continental Land and Development Corporation. 8 properties, she said, all transferred in the past 2 years, all previously encumbered by loans through Ridgeback Bank, all transferred at prices substantially below their assessed value, all currently held by a Denver company whose principals have documented connections to 2 railroad companies currently planning western expansion. The room had been getting quieter as she spoke. Not the quiet of boredom or confusion, but the opposite kind, the quiet of a great deal of attention being paid. Martha Kellner stood up from the 3rd row. She did not wait to be recognized or invited. She stood the way women stand when they have been sitting with something for a long time and are done sitting. My husband Wallace borrowed $500 from Ridgeback Bank in the spring of 1874, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the way voices carry when there is nothing uncertain behind them. He kept his own record of that, the amount, and the terms, because he was a careful man, and that is what careful men do. When the bank later told us we owed $3,800, he could not make the numbers agree, and he asked Crane directly twice to explain it. Crane said the arithmetic was correct. My husband believed in arithmetic. He could not reconcile what he knew with what the bank was telling him. She paused. We lost the land his father left him. 7 months later, my husband was dead. She sat down. The silence after she sat down was the kind that precedes a shift, the moment before weather changes or a river changes course, when everything that has been building reaches the point where it can no longer hold its previous shape. Crane said, "This is an outrage in a collection of unsubstantiated accusations from people who are looking for someone to blame for their own financial difficulties." He said it well. He had a good voice for authority, and he used it. But the room had just heard Martha Kellner, and Martha Kellner had a different kind of authority, the authority of specificity and grief, and the complete absence of anything to gain from saying what she said. The door at the back of the hall opened. Seth Hargrove walked in, and behind him walked a man in a dark coat carrying a document bag. A man in his 50s with the compact, organized bearing of someone who spends his professional life arriving at situations that have become complicated and applying process to them. He was not large or dramatic in his presence. He was simply competent in a way that was immediately visible to anyone who had dealt with competence enough to recognize it. He walked to the front of the room and presented a sealed document to Mayor Pell and said his name was Clement Hollis, that he was an inspector with the Office of the Territorial Governor of Colorado, and that he had been en route to Ridgeback Valley for the past 4 days in response to a formal request for inquiry submitted through the governor's office by a Miss Clara Bennett of Hargrove Ranch. He said this pleasantly and without any sense of theater, because the facts, as he had found with most facts worth presenting, did not require theater. He turned to look at Silas Crane. "Mr. Crane," he said, "the governor's office has been conducting a parallel review of property transfers in Ridgeback Valley for the past 6 weeks, initiated by our own awareness of an unusual volume of title changes in this district. Our review has produced findings that are substantially consistent with the documentation Miss Bennett submitted to us." He reached into his document bag. "I have a warrant here authorizing me to take you into custody pending a formal inquiry into 9 counts of contract fraud and related financial crimes." Crane did not move for a moment. In that moment, something happened to his face that most of the room would have found difficult to describe afterward, because it happened very fast and was replaced just as quickly by the controlled blankness of a man who has decided that how he conducts himself in the next few minutes is the only thing left that he can manage. But Clara saw it because she was closest to him, and she had been watching him the way her father had taught her to watch people who had something to hide. And what she saw in that brief, unguarded moment was not defiance or anger, but something colder and more fundamental, the expression of someone who has calculated odds for a long time and has finally encountered the calculation that does not come out in their favor. Decker moved near the door. His hand went toward his side. Outside the meeting hall, Elias and Nathan were not standing at the door the way men stand when they are waiting for nothing in particular. They were positioned with the relaxed readiness of people who have grown up in country where reading a situation and responding to it before it fully develops is a survival skill. When Decker's hand moved, the 2 men Crane had brought, who were positioned at the sides of the room, also began to shift in a way that had an intention behind it. Elias came through the side door. He was taller than almost anyone else in the room. He moved through the space between the door and the place where Decker was standing without hurrying, and he put himself between Decker and the middle of the room with the simple physical fact of his presence, which was considerable. "The inspector is conducting official business," Elias said in the quiet tone of someone making a statement of fact rather than an argument. "Let him do his work." Decker looked at him. He looked at Nathan, who had appeared in the same moment on the other side of the room and was watching the 2 men near the walls with the attentive patience of someone who has evaluated the situation and is prepared to respond to whatever the next development is. And then Decker looked at Hollis with his warrant, and at Reed with his notebook, and at the room full of Valley families who were watching everything with the focused attention of people who will remember every detail of what they are witnessing for the rest of their lives. He moved his hand away from his side. Silas Crane walked out of the Ridgeback Town Hall with Clement Hollis and 2 of Hollis's men who had come in through the back once Seth arrived. He walked straight with his shoulders back in the suit that was still unrumpled at the end of an hour that had required considerable composure to survive. He got all the way to the street before his step faltered for a moment, just barely, and then he corrected it and continued to the horses without looking back. Clara stood at the front of the room and watched him go. She did not feel the triumph she had half expected to feel. What she felt was something quieter and more final, the specific quality of an account that has been open for a long time being closed. She thought of her father at his desk in Cincinnati with his ordered papers and his practiced patience and his 20 years of telling the truth about numbers, regardless of who found it inconvenient. She thought of Thomas Hargrove choosing a valley and building something in it from nothing and noticing something wrong and doing the right and difficult thing of reaching out to a stranger who might help. She thought about the gap between those two men making that connection, and this moment in this room, all the space between the right thing and the visible outcome of the right thing and all the must of that space. Mayor Pell was trying to bring some order back to a room that had already moved past the need for order into something more like the releasing of a long-held breath. People were talking to each other. Martha Kellner had stood up again and was speaking to the family beside her, a family Clara recognized from Nathan's list. Fletcher Reed was writing in his notebook with the concentrated focus of a man who has been waiting for the real story to arrive and recognizes it when it does. Elias came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He stood at her shoulder the way he had stood at the beginning of all of this, present and solid, and not requiring the moment to be other than what it was. She turned to look at him. The amber eyes were looking at her with the same directness they always had, the unwillingness to look at things sideways. That was his most fundamental quality. But there was something else in them now, something she had seen in small glimpses over the weeks, and that was now simply present without the usual careful management around it. "The first part is done," he said. "Yes," she said. "The rest will take time." "I know. But the first part is done." She nodded. And because she was tired and because the weight of 3 months of carrying her father's unfinished work had just shifted in a way that left her slightly unsteady, she allowed herself for one moment to simply stand beside him and let the room continue around them without requiring herself to manage any part of it. It was enough. For that moment, it was enough. The inquiry that followed the arrest of Silas Crane took most of the summer. Clement Hollis was thorough in the way that the governor's office was thorough when it understood that the case in front of it had implications beyond the immediate situation, when the outcome was likely to be cited in future proceedings and needed to be built on a foundation that would not crack under examination. He worked through every property transfer in Ridgeback Valley over the 6-year period of Crane's operation, cross-referencing the original loan documents where they could be obtained against the bank's records and against the borrower's own account of what they had agreed to. Clara worked alongside him for the first 3 weeks of this process, providing the analytical framework she had built over months and translating her father's annotation system into plain documentation that could be entered into the official record. Fletcher Reed published his first article in the Denver Post 10 days after Crane's arrest. It ran on the front page, and it was accurate, and it was thorough, and it named every element of the scheme, from the fraudulent contracts to Pacific Continental to the railroad connection, and it was read by enough people in enough positions of consequence that the governor's office doubled the resources allocated to the inquiry by the following week. Pacific Continental's principals hired lawyers who spent 3 months arguing jurisdiction and precedent and then spent another 2 months in negotiations that ultimately produced a settlement acknowledging the company's role in the scheme and the railroad money behind it. By September, the formal findings were complete. Crane was convicted on 9 counts. The 2 deaths that had initiated the investigation, Thomas Hargrove's riding accident and Henry Bennett's fire, were listed in the inquiry report as unresolved matters of separate investigation, with findings that suggested circumstances inconsistent with the official conclusions. The language was careful, and the legal threshold for criminal charges in those deaths was not met, but the language was in the public record, and Fletcher Reed wrote about it, and the truth of what had happened to 2 careful, honest men was documented in a form that would last. 6 of the 9 families affected by the fraud recovered their land titles. 3 families whose land had passed through too many subsequent transactions to be cleanly returned received financial settlements from the estate of Pacific Continental's Colorado holdings, which the court had determined were built substantially on the proceeds of fraud. Martha Kellner was the first person in the valley to receive her restored title on a warm morning in late August, and she drove to Hargrove Ranch that afternoon and sat in the kitchen and drank Clara's coffee and did not say very much, but sat in the particular way of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been relieved of it. The wedding was in May. Elias had said, with the directness that was his nature, that he did not want to do it while the inquiry was still running, not because he was uncertain about anything, but because he did not want the beginning of something good to share its date with the ongoing business of something that needed to be finished. He said this practically and without decoration, and Clara understood it as she had come to understand most things he said, which was that the stated reason was the real reason, and there was nothing else behind it. They married on a Saturday in the third week of May, when the valley was at the height of its spring color, the meadow grass so green it looked impossible, the creek full and bright with snowmelt, the mountains showing their full height now that the winter haze had cleared. The circuit preacher came from the neighboring county, and the ceremony took place outside the main house on the south side, where the afternoon sun was warmest, in front of the porch, where the pines provided a backdrop that no church could have improved on. Nathan stood as Elias's witness, which was Nathan's choice, and Elias's without either of them needing to discuss it, and Seth stood beside Nathan and did not try to suppress anything he felt, which was his way, and it suited the day better than restraint would have. Martha Kellner sat in the front row of the chairs Seth had borrowed from the church in Ridgeback, because Seth had decided that having chairs made it a proper occasion. Fletcher Reed had written to say he would try to come, and had arrived that morning from Denver, looking slightly travel-worn and pleased with himself in equal measure. The Prescott family was there. Two other families from Nathan's list were there. The valley had come in the degree that a valley comes to things, which is substantially when the thing matters. The traditional vows were said clearly and were meant. And then Elias, who had evidently decided that the occasion required something beyond the traditional language added to his vows, a single addition that was not prepared in remarks, but simply what he needed to say before the preacher concluded. I'm not a man who finds it easy to say the most important things, but you should know that this land and this family are standing today because of what you brought here when you came. And I intend to spend whatever years I have making sure that was worth the trouble it cost you. The trouble it cost you. The particular plain-spoken acknowledgement of everything that had brought her here, her father and what he had lost, the 3 months of grief and purpose, and the long journey west, all of it stated without evasion and without sentiment, which was the only way she would have wanted it stated. She added to her own vows, "My father taught me that numbers tell the truth if you know how to read them." What I didn't expect was that this valley would teach me the same thing about people. I know how to read you, Elias Hargrove. I know what you are, and I'm grateful for every morning since April that I've been able to see it clearly. The preacher spoke the final words over them in the good May sunlight, and the mountains stood behind everything the way they always did, enormous and patient present without requiring acknowledgement. Seth cried. He denied this afterward and continued to deny it for years. But Nathan had seen it, and Clara had seen it, and it was part of the day, the way all the true things were part of the day. The first snow of the following winter came in November. It arrived in the night, and by morning the valley was transformed in the way that first snowfalls transform things, making the familiar new again, covering the evidence of the season just past with a clean white surface that promised nothing and simply was. The mountains were invisible behind the low gray sky, but their presence was felt in the weight of the cold air coming down from their elevations. Clara was at the desk in the small room off the main hall by the time the light was full enough to work, by which was before anyone else in the house was moving. The desk had been Thomas Hargrove's, and before that it had been the desk of whoever the previous owner of this land had been, and before that there had been no desk at all, only the land itself. She had been using it for 6 months now, and it felt like hers in the way that things feel like yours when you have put enough honest work on them. The ledger open in front of her was new. Her own begun from the first line, no inherited pages. The title she had written on the cover was plain Hargrove Ranch Accounts, 1876 onward. The figures inside it were the figures of a ranch that was still small but solvent, that had paid its legitimate debts and had no illegitimate ones, that had made careful decisions about what to invest and what to defer, and whose cattle numbers in the spring pasture count had exceeded the previous years by 11 head, which was the result of choices made with the specific knowledge of what the land could support and what it could not. She was working through the winter supply calculations when she heard the boots on the stairs. the particular sound of them that she had memorized without trying to the way you memorize the sounds of a place once it becomes yours. Elias appeared in the doorway. He had been out to the barn already, she could tell, because there was cold air still on him, and his coat was still on, and his hands were red from it. He looked at the ledger and then at her in the familiar way, the way that did not require explanation. "Nathan wants to talk about the north fence when you're done," he said. "After breakfast," she said. "I need another 20 minutes here." He nodded. He did not leave immediately. He stood in the doorway in the way he sometimes stood when something had settled in him that he did not need to put into words, but that he also did not want to simply carry past without acknowledgement. "Good work," he said, nodding toward the ledger. She looked up at him. In the pale winter light from the window, his face was the face she had looked at every day for 8 months, weathered and direct and honest, the face of a man who had never once said something he did not mean. "Thank you," she said. He went out. She heard him in the kitchen, heard Nathan's voice joining his, heard Seth's question and Nathan's shorter answer, heard the sounds of the morning beginning in the Hargrove house in the ordinary way of mornings that are ordinary because everything underneath them is finally sound. She turned back to the ledger. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall over Ridgeback Valley, covering the meadow and the creek banks and the fence lines and the road and the rooftops of the buildings that Thomas Hargrove had built from nothing in a valley he had chosen because he understood what it was. The mountains were there behind the low gray sky, enormous and patient, waiting without expectation for whatever the people below them would build or lose or find their way back to in the years still ahead. Clara dipped her pen and wrote the next line of figures. The numbers were correct. They were always correct when she wrote them. This was the thing her father had given her, the most reliable thing she owned, the ability to look at what was true and record it accurately so that it could not be argued with or altered by someone who wanted it to say something else. The morning light grew in the window. The snow fell. The ranch held as it had held before and would hold after, built out of what good men left behind when they built honestly, and what the people who came after them were willing to carry forward. That was all. That was enough. That in the end was everything.